Good evening, everybody. It's about time to get started. And right now it's raining out there, so that's good. Good to see all of you. We are in the middle of Genesis 15 tonight, and we'll jump in. We are a hair behind, so we might be a little bit short on review. I believe so. I will check right quick. That's all right. Very good. So rather than doing each chapter's contents, let's think a little bit bigger here. Genesis 1 through 11, how would we summarize the contents of those chapters?
Creation and the sin of man.
That's right. Creation and the sin of man. That's right. The beginnings of humanity might be a good way of thinking about it. How we got here and what went wrong might be a way to think about it. And so really chapters 1 through 11 are setting up why there needs to be some kind of solution to the problems of the world. And that those problems are not just on an individual basis, but, global. When you have the rejection of God in Genesis 6, you have the rejection of God in Genesis 11. There's no people, there's no group, there's no nation, there's no language that's not touched by rebellion against God. So how is God going to address that? Well, that's the answer that we get beginning in chapter 12. And what is God's plan? How is God going to work out a plan by which He can bless those nations that are in rebellion against Him? What does that look like? He's going to make a people out of Abram. I was reading a commentary this week, and it summarized chapter 12 as, for God so loved the world, He called Abram. And that's interesting because this is the very beginnings of that gospel plan. And, why did He do that? Well, I don't know, but He loved humanity. For God so loved the world that He called Abram, which initiates this process of creating a nation and giving Abram and his descendants land. And ultimately, there's going to be a seed, there's going to be a descendant that we are looking for who's going to be a blessing to all nations. Now, we're still waiting on that seed. And Genesis 15 raises one of those questions. Abram has a question. What is Abram's question at the beginning of chapter 15? Yeah, how will I know in the middle? And so what's his question about Eliezer of Damascus? Yeah, is this what you meant by me having a seed? That Eliezer, my right-hand man, my servant, that he would inherit my possessions. And God says, no, you're going to have your very own son. I'm not exactly sure how far we got to, maybe about verse 7 or so. So anyway, anything you want to say as far as picking up till there?
You know, Genesis is a book of origins. Of course, the creation is a high priority in that, but we've seen after the flood, a new beginning, and now we're seeing another new beginning, more towards a spiritual
That's right.
solution.
Yeah. All right, you want to take verse 7 and let's go as far as you want to.
All right. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said to him, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought all these, cut them in half, and laid each over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in half. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. And as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, a dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. They shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So we see here, Abram's got questions, and of course, in the first 6 verses we see the nation promise re-emphasized. Here we see the land is going to be be emphasized here. But also, there's a little bit more detail given to us here. What do we know about his descendants? What's going to happen? Yeah, they're going to go to a foreign land and they're going to be in bondage for 4 generations, some 400 years. I think Paul said 430 years exactly. But for that long, they're going to be in bondage. But then what's going to happen? They will come out of that bondage. And
come out, but they'll have great possessions when they leave.
yes. And what are they going to inherit? Where are they going to go when they leave that land? Yeah, they're going to come back to this land, the land of Canaan. Now, in verses 7 through 11, you have a ceremony. I don't think we've covered this up to this point, but we're going to see it multiple times going forward. And it's an ancient covenant, how it was depicted. And here you have animals that were slain and cut in half. The bigger animals were cut in half, and they would be laid so, one half on one side, one on the other. And of course, you had the pigeon and the dove that were just laid opposite of each other. And part of the ritual of this covenant would be the two parties walking through that. We'll see how this unfolds as we go further here. But that's the traditional ceremony of a covenant being established. So that's what we're seeing in verses 7 through 11. We'll see that in completion as we pick up in verse 17. But Abram is not going to be part of this going away, going off, being oppressed. He's going to die in a good old age. He's going to die a peaceful man, per se. But his lineage, his descendants will suffer. But why is all this going to play out? Why is there inheriting the land, and why is that being delayed? Yes. So when they come out, not only are they going to just be given the land, but they're going to be used as instruments of judgment that will be pronounced against the Amorites. That sin has not been completed yet. God has given them time and opportunity, but there will come a point in time where God is going to say enough's enough. And that's when he's going to use Israel as an instrument.
Yeah, that's great. So in verses 17 and following, as Mr. Gerald may mention, this is picturing for us an ancient covenant. And I'm going to make a reference to another passage in just a second that's from a long time later, from the book of Jeremiah, but I think reflects what's going on here. So remember, Abram has cut these animals in half. And normally what would happen is that both people would walk through the middle of the animals that have been cut. Now watch what happens here. Verse 17, when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I will give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. So what passes through the animals? Yeah. The smoking firepot and the flaming torch. Now, I take it to be that this is symbolic of the Lord passing through these animals. Who does not pass through the animals? Abraham. So remember the question that got us started on this line of thinking here. In verse 7, how am I to know that I shall possess it? Well, then verse 13, the Lord said to Abram, know for certain. All right, so this is how you can know for certain. And the word that, when it says that the Lord made a covenant with Abram, the word is cut. The Lord cut a covenant with Abram. In Jeremiah chapter 34, this is a passage that refers to the making of a covenant a long time later, but I think it reflects the tradition, the ceremony that's happening here. In Jeremiah 34 and verse 18, these men, what they had done is they had made a covenant with some of their slaves at the time of the Babylonian captivity, the siege. And then when the siege kind of let up, they went back on their word. They had said that they were going to free these enslaved people that they had, and then when they realized that things weren't coming to an end, they kind of go back and say, oh wait, never mind, we're going to... Now look at verse 18. And the men who transgressed my covenant and did not keep the terms of the covenant that they made before me, I will make them like the calf that they cut in two and pass between its parts. All right, so I think here's the picture that's going on. Abram cuts these animals in two. And the normal procedure would be that both men, both covenant parties, would pass through this and say, if I don't uphold my end of the deal, let me end up like them. That's what it meant to cut a covenant. You're making an agreement and you're saying, this is what happens to me if I don't uphold my side of this. Now notice what happens. Only the Lord passes through. And you might say, well, that seems silly. The Lord's not going to cut himself in two if he doesn't. Remember what the Hebrew writer says? When he could swear by none greater, he swore by himself. Now that's really referring to what happens in chapter 22 when God says, I swear that I will give you your descendants. But it's a similar thing here, where God is saying, I want you to know for certain. And you can know because I told you. But I'm going to give you even more assurance than that. I will put myself under the covenant curse if I don't uphold my end of the deal. And notice that, of course, Abram had to meet some conditions prior to this, and he has to continue to follow God all along. But God really is taking the responsibility for carrying this out entirely on himself, right? It doesn't really matter that the descendants of Abram are going to be awful, right? They're going to be terrible. God says, I'm still going to bring about what I promised. And ultimately, he's still going to bring about that blessing, even though the people of Israel are going to miss out on the blessings of it. And that's how God's covenants often work. God is going to have a blessing. He's going to have a benefit for the nations. Every individual Israelite gets to determine whether or not they're going to share in that blessing. They're going to be the vessel, whether they want to be a part of it or not. God's going to use them. But it might not be any benefit to them if they don't commit as well. Does that make sense? You see the imagery there in Jeremiah 34. I think that's a good cross-reference for thinking about what's going on here. And then you have the nations and the boundaries explained in verses 18 and 19. Now, why would that be important at this moment? Why would that be specifically relevant at this occasion? Who's reading this the first time? The children of Israel, as they're about to go into this land and face off against these people and try to occupy these boundaries. And so what they need to recognize is that this is a promise that's been a long time in the making. And that there is a divine justification for what they're about to do when they go in the land. They're going to utterly destroy these people. And somebody might say, well, is that the right thing to do? And God says, well, I've given them 400 years. I've given them a long time of delay, maybe more than 400 years. I've given them a long time where they have had opportunity to repent, where I could have just taken them out and given the land to Abraham 400 years ago. But he didn't do that. And so Israel is not being used in the book of Joshua because they are so righteous. Right? The book of Deuteronomy will spell that out and say, look, you're not here because of your righteousness. But they are being used because of the wickedness of the nations that they are going in to judge. And later on, Israel will be judged with nations wickeder than them, Assyria and Babylon. And that's how God, he can use them as a tool for his purposes. Anything else through verse 15 that you would like, through chapter 15, excuse me, that you'd like to say?
What happened was, not only was God lenient against them to actually that they could repent from what they'd done, but it allowed them, while he was not just doing away with them, they actually built all the cities and the houses,
yeah,
the fortifications, planted all the vineyards, so that when the Israelites actually went in, they didn't have to create nothing.
Right.
They just destroyed the people, and everything was there for the taking.
Yeah, very good. It's interesting. All right. So, if we're keeping a track of highlight moments in the book of Genesis, I would say that Genesis 12 is one of those key highlight moments for the promise of Abraham, and 15 would be another one that you might want to mark down. If you're just going through and looking at the promises that God's making, 15 is key because it kind of spells out, why in the world do we have to spend this time down in Egypt? Well, it's in accomplishing this purpose that God has, that he explains here in chapter 15, and then we'll come back to this in the book of Exodus. All right, anything else? Very good. Chapter 16, ready?
All right. Now Sarai Abram's wife had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. Sarah said to Abram, "Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan. Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. So we see in 16 that Sarai is mindful of the promise that's been made. And of course, she's barren. They've been in the land for how long now? 10 years. This promise is, getting a little bit of age on them. So they decide, obviously, and you can somewhat connect with the rationale. I mean, if Abram left Haran at 75 and they've been in the land for 10 years, how old is Abram? He's 85. She's 10 years younger. She's 75. How is this going to be accomplished? God's promised that this is going to take place, but nothing has taken place. I wonder if Hagar was a spoil from their trip to Egypt, but here she has this servant, and she says, "Take her as wife, and we can fulfill the promise through her." So Abram does, and how does that work out? The way it always does. Exactly. This seems appalling, certainly in our culture, but as we go through the Bible history, we're going to see a lot about concubines. And what was a concubine? They were a wife of, a second-class wife, a wife of lesser status. She wouldn't have any authority within the household. Her children may or may not inherit the blessings, family blessings and whatnot. That would be up to the father, but she's a wife nevertheless. But once she conceives, how does this turn out? How does this play out?
Sarah was jealous of her to the point that she goes to Abram and wants him to do something about it. He tells her that it's her maid. You handle her the way you want to.
Well, there's definitely some friction here, but it seems to me that it may be coming from Hagar, in the sense that maybe she's a little bit, feeling a little bit boastful here. She can provide Abram something that, the second class wife can provide something the first class wife cannot. And maybe she's kind of throwing that in her face. We don't know exactly what, but you can imagine some scenarios here. And so, Abram says, you handle it. This is your situation. You have authority over. You deal with it. So that's what she does. She treats her harshly, and Hagar flees. She leaves. So everything is falling apart, it looks like.
This is actually the second time that the wife being involved is actually not heeded to what God is saying. I mean, you take Eve, actually got Adam to take a fruit. And then now she knows, because she's had Abram to tell her that they're going to have a child and his descendants. And she took it upon herself, instead of believing in God that eventually, whatever time would be, that she would have a child, that she took it upon herself to say, okay, let's take my maid and we'll have a child that way. But that ain't the way God had explained it to Abram when Abram explained it to her actually how it's going to do. So she actually went against God, what he had done promise to do it her way.
Now, I want to be fair in all this. The promise was made to Abram. It was never made to Sarah up to this point that we're aware of.
Yeah.
If
So-
we know that he had to tell her, and she was his only wife.
Yeah. So I think that. So could you understand why she would do this? I think so, because in chapter 15, God says, "From your loins," right? From your. Didn't say anything about Sarah. Now, here's to go with your point. It seems to me that God has given Abram exactly the instructions he needed every step of the way, right? Whatever Abram needed to do, God told him to do that. So if the time comes where Abram needs to have another wife in order to bring this about, God's going to give him that instruction. And I think what it would be presumption as maybe the sin here. It's and oftentimes it is our lack of faith comes out in presumption, right? Well, God can't get it done if I don't go ahead and fill in the blanks for him, right? And so it is not wrong to look for ways to accomplish God's purposes, right? It's not wrong to look for ways to do God's will. It is wrong when we do things presumptuously, thinking that we have to, that God wasn't exact enough in his instructions. God will give us the instructions that we need along the way. And I think that's where, and you made mention at the end of verse 2, Abram listened to the voice of Sarah. This is almost exactly the same wording as Adam listened or hearkened to the voice of his wife, Eve. And so it's supposed to be when we read this, we should be reminded of what happens in the garden. And what happens in the garden? Eve does not trust that God has her best interest at heart. Sarah, notice up in verse 2, she doesn't just say that God's not helping here. She says God is hindering me, which is a whole nother set of problems, right? That God is actually preventing Sarah from conceiving. And so then Hagar is expecting success, right? No, right? Not in God's eyes, right? Even though it accomplished exactly what Sarah intended for it to accomplish. And yet, when we act presumptuously, here's the lesson. God's way works. And God's way is never for us to go ahead and be presumptuous and do it our own way. If Abram needed to leave Ur in order to accomplish God's purpose, God would tell him, and he did. If Abram needed to marry another wife in order to accomplish God's purposes, God would have told him, and he didn't. He didn't do that. And I think the assumption should have been that it would be with Sarah anyway.
You know, I like to put myself in their shoes.
Yeah.
You know, and connect with, you know, maybe their thinking, what was going through their mind. I mean, this promise, you know, was at least 10 years old.
Mm-hmm.
We know. So, and time is, you know, for Abram, you know, time is getting away.
Yeah.
It feels like, certainly. You know, that's not to justify, like you said, this is a presumptuous sin. They had the same information we do from Genesis 2. One man, one woman become one. You know, and that's it. That's the law of God there. That's all we have. One husband, one wife. And here they extend that.
Yeah.
To try to accomplish this feat here. And you know, there's no excuse for it. But still, you know, like you said, sometimes that's what we extend ourselves beyond the Word of God to try to accomplish good, and it turns out bad, and we wonder why.
Yeah, yeah, and notice the consequences here are very similar to the consequences in the sin in the garden between the husband and the wife. Who does Sarah blame here? Abraham, right? Well, Sarah, it was your idea. You know, you were the one who came up with it, and may the wrong be done to me be on you. And then verse 6, but Abram said, she's in your power. It seems to me that Abram kind of wimps out here and just said, well, you take care of it. You know, I don't want to be held responsible for that. Well, he is held responsible. It's his responsibility, but he kind of removes himself out from under the burden, washes his hands of it. So anyway, so what does we're gonna see this in verse 7 and following, that what Sarai does as a response. But before we get to that, do you have other thoughts through verse 6?
If only they could have been patient.
Yeah.
Just a few more.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And you know, me and Martha, we thought about, you know, the Psalms. One of the themes of the Psalms is wait on the Lord.
Oh yeah,
Wait
very good.
on the Lord. You know, in His time, and not ours. And we struggle with that. So I mean, man hasn't changed within the last 4,000 years or so. I mean, we still suffer with the same thing. We want
That's right.
things to be accomplished in our time when we're ready, not when God is.
That's right.
I think that's a principle that we can apply to today.
Yeah.
We should think that things will be okay with God, just so that we can do things a certain
Yeah.
way, and it'll be okay with Him. It must be all
Yeah. So let's think about something, and maybe this is a good way to apply this. Does God want more people to be a part of a local group? Yeah, I think so, because more people part of a local group is more souls. Well, we can short circuit that process pretty quickly. If we start offering steak dinners on Sunday afternoons after services, but you got to be here for church on Sunday morning to get it, I bet we could get some people here, more people if we want. Now, that's maybe a good idea, right? Well, we'll get them in. But what we're doing is we're trying to short circuit that process by using something that God hasn't authorized us to do. And there's a lot of places that do that. They use fun or games or something like that as a way to attract people. And maybe they started off with a good intention, right? That we're going to help accomplish the purposes that God has for us. It reminds me of what Solomon says. I mean, maybe it's David. It's in the Chronicles account. When David wants to build the temple, David said, God said, it was good in your heart that you wanted to do it. But it wasn't your place to. I think there's a good motive sometimes behind people who are wanting to do things. Well, what happens is we have a Sarah Hagar type situation where we say, well, God hadn't said anything about this. We have no basis upon which to build this or to do this. But let's just go ahead and do it anyway because it'll help us to accomplish one of God's purposes. And I think that is a temptation. I think a temptation is, maybe we have promises from God that He'll take care of us physically. And if we don't lie, we're not going to be able to keep our job. So what do we do then? So the question always is, are we going to trust what God has said that He will use to accomplish in keeping His promises? Or are we going to leave it up to ourselves to be the ones to figure out how God is going to keep those promises? And so all that is to say is that here is, I think we can be hard on Sarah here. But as we are, we all be hard on ourselves too, because sometimes we make these same kind of decisions to short circuit the route by which we get to the promises of God, and we don't have to do that. As Gerald will say, even if physically the promises don't come to fruition in the way we thought they ought to, there is no doubt that God will accomplish His purposes for the people who trust Him and serve Him. And that's the idea of waiting on the Lord, is trusting Him, hoping in Him, letting Him be the one to accomplish it. And of course, we do everything in response to His will. We go to work and we tell the truth and we want to reach out to people. We do the things He's given us instructions to do in order to help that along, but we don't take it on our own authority. We good? All right, very good. And those are good things to think about. What are the ways we can apply these things? Anything else through verse 6? All right, so verse 7. So now Hagar is cast out at the end of verse 6. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarah. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him. And he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing, or El Roi. For she said, truly here I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. Okay, so what do you notice about... So we have the angel of the Lord here. I think we're talking about the Lord in some way, because down in verse 13, she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. So the word angel just is messenger. So we have some kind of embodiment of God here speaking to Hagar. And what do you notice about the Lord in this? What do we learn about God?
He's sees all.
He sees all. Even a runaway Egyptian slave cast out by her mistress, he sees her. And Hagar is amazed by that. She's offered. That is the thing that she notices about God, is that He is the God who sees and in this case, who hears. I was reading, and one commentary said that in all of ancient Near Eastern literature, so all the literature from Mesopotamia, there is no other known instance where deity addresses a woman by name. So all the gods of Mesopotamia, never did they address a woman by name, except in this case, where God speaks to a cast out Egyptian bondwoman, Hagar. So I think there is a powerful lesson in that. God obviously is concerned about Abram and Sarai, right? Like they are obviously the focuses of Genesis. But that does not mean that the people who are in kind of the perimeter or on the margins are not, that God doesn't see them as well. Now, what's the instruction that God gives to Hagar? Go back. Now, that seems pretty insensitive, doesn't it? Right? He does not seem to be on the side of the oppressed here. But she has a responsibility. Now, later things are going to change and she's going to be gone. But God does not only leave her in a position of submission, but He also gives her great promises. And what's the promise that He makes about her son? Well, just in general, that's fine. Yes, that he will become a great nation. So, very similar to the promise that is going to be made to Abram and to Isaac, he'll be made a great nation. Now, he seems like he's going to have some conflict, that there's going to be some lack of restraint on the part of Ishmael that's going to bring him into conflict with some of his friends, but maybe some independence even that comes with that, as you see. Now, she is going to name him Ishmael because God has heard. God has listened. And Ishmael sounds like the word for God heard. God hears. And so God hears and God sees, and Hagar is impressed by that. And so she does go back. We'll see this in verses 15 and 16. Anything else?
I believe that this is actually not it. It's God using the messenger, the angel of the Lord, because He would have said, I heard your affliction. And He says, because the Lord has heard your affliction. And there are several cases throughout the Bible where the angel of the Lord has actually come to Mary.
Yeah.
And
So,
all that, and told them what their child was and what he was to be named.
yeah. Okay, so look at this in verse 10. The angel of the Lord said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring. And then in the end of verse 13, truly here, I have seen him who looks after me. Verses 11 and 12 are poetic, and the reason she's naming him Ishmael is because the Lord heard, right? And so, yes, he could have said, because I have heard. I realize, I don't know that every place where the angel of the Lord is referenced that we're talking to some kind of embodiment of the divine. There are some places where it is that without a doubt. For example, in Genesis 18, when Abram hosts the three visitors, one of those is described as the Lord over and over and over again in that text. In fact, I think it's 18 verse 1. It says, Yahweh appeared to Abram by the oaks of Mamre. So I see that, and I don't. The only point that I would make from that is that already in the Old Testament, we're getting this idea that there's the Lord and there's the angel of the Lord, and that sometimes that Venn diagram is pretty overlappy, right? There's a lot of slippage between those terms, and yeah, go ahead.
Would you say that it would be the Lord speaking, whether it was directly or indirectly? It's
Yeah. What I want to leave room for is that I think in the Old Testament we already get some idea that the one God is a little more complex than maybe You know, like there's already this idea of a Trinity or something like that. We've already had reference to the Spirit of the Lord, and here we have the angel of the Lord that also speaks as if He is the Lord, and just that that complexity there leaves room so that when Jesus comes and says, "I'm the Son of God," that we have some categories for how that might make sense, and maybe the angel of the Lord is one way in which we can kind of make sense of that. But yes, that's exactly right. Look at 15 and 16 just real quickly. Hagar bears Abram a son, and Abram called the name of the son whom Hagar bore Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. Those numbers are going to be important as we go along. Now, what does it signify that Abram is the one who's doing the naming? What do you think about that? She told him what happened. He accepts it. And I think the accepting it is not just accepting the story of what happened, but accepting that this is his son. That there's an ownership that kind of takes place, a responsibility recognition here when he says, okay, this is Ishmael. This is a pretty big moment between a father and the son during this naming process, and I think that probably indicates some level of, well, by the time we get to 17, Abram thinks Ishmael's the one, right? And there hasn't really been anything from the end of 16 to the beginning of 17 that would indicate to me that God has done anything to dispel that illusion until we get to chapter 17. So for about 13 years, Abram will go along with the idea that Ishmael, he will be going with the idea that Ishmael is the one. And really, even in what he said to Hagar, you could say, verse 10, I'll multiply your offspring so they cannot be numbered for multitude. And Abram was like, well, that sounds familiar. You know, I've heard that before. And so perhaps that there's something to that for Abram trying to put these pieces together and how all this is going to work out. I'm not sure. He does have more children with Keturah. But I can't remember. I don't think he does with Hagar because Hagar is sent out at the end of whenever. At the end of some chapter that I looked at today. 17. In the middle of 17. Is that right? No, it's not. Yes, it's a long time later. Yeah, that's right. Very good. 21. Yes, 21. Yeah, I don't think so because when he sends out Hagar, it says he sent out Hagar and Ishmael. Now, he later will have I assume it's after Sarah dies that he'll have more children with Keturah. But
He doesn't marry Keturah until after she's.
I think that's right. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Those are good questions. Yes, sir.
One thing about why the angel of the Lord wanted her to return.
Yeah.
In reference of 1 Peter 2 and verse 18, it says, servant, be submissive to your master with all fear, not only to good and gentle, but also to the harsh. For this commendable, if because of conscience toward God, one endures grief, suffers wrongfully, for what it credit is it if you are beaten for your faults and take it patiently. But when you do good and suffer it, if you take it patiently, it is commendable before God. For this to you were called to be Christ, also suffered with us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps. So, in reference to Peter's speech right there was that when you are being treated, whether it's a servant in good conditions or if you're beaten, that you are to do it because Christ suffered for all, even though he was come here to be a servant.
Yeah.
But that shows the reference of why that she was supposed to go back and follow that.
Yep.
I believe.
Yeah. Good. All right. Anything else? Ready? Chapter 17.
When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, may multiply you greatly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you in the nations, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So again, as he has done in chapter 12 and chapter 15, he's reiterating the nation and the land promise here. But in amongst that, he's changing his name. Why is he changing his name? Any thoughts on that? Yeah. I failed to write down in my notes what Abram meant. Father of
Is it exalted
exalted father?
That's right.
Yeah. And Abraham changes it to father of a multitude. So there is a different dynamic. I mean, God has already exalted Abram, up to this point. But now he's going to extend his blessing to him in a different direction. And he's going to multiply his fruit.
Could it also be that when he changed his name, later on we read about the covenant that he actually makes with him for the promise, and by making a new type of covenant with Abraham, then it's definitive. It was when God changed his name from that point on, was this new covenant that he made with him that we read later on.
Yeah.
Maybe so. Yeah, well, I mean, I'm just looking at verse 5. Your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. And I wonder if in part that comes as a result of Ishmael now going to be a nation, and Isaac's going to be a nation, and then from Isaac you're going to have Jacob and Esau that are both going to be nations. And so the promise to Abraham is expanding in some ways here. And also, he's going to do that physically and spiritually, right? So you have here, maybe this was part of the plan all along, because he's going to be a father of nations, not just in the sense that you can trace physical nations back up to Abraham's descendants, but that there's a multitude that are descendants of Abraham because he's the father of the faith. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and really, so as far as the physical land and nation promise, they're going to be tied to circumcision here in verses 9 and following.
You think it may also mean like later on, it seems like it's going to be pretty soon that Isaac's going to be born.
That's right.
You think that may have anything to do with it?
That this is the moment when he does that.
Okay.
Yeah, perhaps, and the fact that Sarah's name is going to be changed to down. And so that is, this is the first time that she has specifically been brought into the discussion. Is that, verse 15. So.
It just seems that they're both getting around the same time that it's about to happen.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
This term everlasting is being used here again. And as we go through chapter 17, we're going to see it numerous times. And from what I understand, it can be interpreted as forever or an indefinite period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And typically, from what I understand, the context will dictate which is which.
I think that's right.
And with this, this is a covenant. So this is a contract between two parties. So there is conditions. And as long as you meet those conditions, this is upheld. But what happens when the conditions are broke?
Yeah,
The covenant is broke.
that's right.
Indefinite.
Yeah. So I think the Hebrew word is something like olam, and it means on and on and on. But notice it like in verse 8, for example, and this may be what you refer to, for an everlasting possession, talking about the land of Canaan. Well, everlasting in the sense of for all eternity, that's not true. Even if you say, well, still Israel's inherit, well, they're not going to inherit it for eternity. like if physical Israel is not going to have Israel forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever, right? Without end. And so maybe the idea there is indefinite. So that like by book of Joshua, God's accomplished that promise. They're going to be removed from the land. And then the land, that physical land promise is not going to remain. Now, there's still some like echoes of that in the promises that we have of what we're going to inherit. So like the Hebrew writer will use the promise of the land to point forward to the spiritual rest that we will enter. So there's still a way in which that promise is still yet to be fulfilled, but not in the sense of that physical land promise. So anyway.
Physically, they lose the land multiple times.
That's right.
Throughout history.
Yeah, that's right. Right. All right. Well, we're out of time, and so I won't be here Sunday night or Wednesday night, but I think Austin's going to take my place and far exceed it anyway. So we'll look forward to that. Y'all will. I know.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.